At Bookham Baptist Church, we believe in a principle of Sabbath, and many of you have heard us talk about Sabbath being a 24-hour weekly period of rest. And in that time, we stop, rest, delight, and contemplate. Those are the four principles that we try to shape our Sabbath round. Stopping from ideally paid and unpaid work. I know, you immediately say that's not practical. Resting in all sorts of ways. That's not just sleep or napping, but mental, emotional rest. Delighting in creation and in the good things of life, and contemplating God, his creation, and our relationship with him. And my aim, really, as I entered my sabbatical, was to try to extend that Sabbath principle into the 3-month period. Really, I'm going to put it in a nutshell, I would say I decided to give myself to some disciplines which would deepen my life in God. So that decision led to the 12 weeks being divided in 2 halves, really. 6 weeks interspersed across the 12 were taken up with the pilgrimage, which took about 2 weeks, and the exercises of St. Ignatius, which were really 4 weeks altogether. And the other half, the 6 weeks, I was at home with my family. I worked a fair bit with fixed hour prayer, which I had never done before. I did some gardening and reading and resting, and I loved it. And part of the delay of doing this evening is that it was such a precious time that it is really difficult to know how to share it. And at the same time, I feel this huge debt of gratitude to you as a church, because there are many, many churches across the world that do not do this for their ministers. They do not allow their ministers to take sabbaticals. And so it is a great thing that we hold it here. So I feel this great debt of gratitude, but at the same time, this sabbatical has been a super personal treasure trove, and it is difficult to describe. Many of you will witness to the fact that God has his own unique way of working with us, doesn't he? He works with us all in a completely different way, and at different paces, and in different forms. And it feels very unique, it feels very gentle, and yet really awesome and awe-inspiring. So this really feels like quite a faltering attempt to describe what isn't easily described. And I hope to give you a taste of my experience rather than simply describe it. But Phil will tell you, it's just taken me hours to prepare this, because I was up till 1 o'clock last night. Does that go in? Does that not go in? And just agonizing over it. Anyway, we're here now. If you're a person given to activity like me, you might find that your emotions are a little hard to access. And I find that music, particularly music that doesn't have words, is one of the keys to working out what it is I'm feeling and what's going on for me. So, the exercises of St. Ignatius. I am not an expert in the exercises of Ignatius, okay? I'm not trained to give them. I haven't even finished them. And my knees are knocking in case Jed has decided to watch or is going to watch later. So I just need... Is he? Oh, my goodness. Right. Hello, Jed. Oh. If you don't know about the exercises of St. Ignatius, you're far better to Google it than you are to believe that what I'm going to say is all there is to know. This is really just my take, and it's my take so far of the experience of doing exercises. So what are the exercises of St. Ignatius? They are a compilation, a gathering of meditations and prayer exercises, contemplative practices, developed by Ignatius Loyola in the early 1500s. Their purpose is to deepen your relationship with God. They used to be exclusively used by clergy. And for centuries, they were given as what was called a long retreat, which was a 30-day silent retreat. And they would be they're given by a spiritual director. So they're done in solitude and silence, but you would see a spiritual director to be given each exercise. They're now more commonly done in what's called the retreat in daily life. And some of the church have done the retreat in daily life, or the 19th annotation. And this is a way of doing it in your normal rhythm. So you can get a spiritual director and they give you some exercises and you work through it at your own pace. It can take months. I don't think it can be done in weeks. I think probably you're talking about a year to 2 years to work through the 19th annotation. And that's how, practically speaking, most people can do it. It's not easy for most to do, obviously, what I had the privilege of doing. But they can be done in Jesuit spirituality retreat centres. And that's where I went, to one called St Bino's in North Wales, near Rhyl. They offer the exercises either as that long retreat of a full 30 days of solitude and silence, or you can do 2 spells of 15 days each, or you can do 3 spells of 10 days. And that's the one I chose. So I started my sabbatical with 10 days, and I finished my sabbatical with 10 days. And on the 21st of January, I'm going back to do the 3rd session. Yes, so is there a map? Oh, there's the map, right. So I've done a really scribbly red dot, and that's kind of roughly, my dad is a geographer, but that might not be exactly where St Bino's is, but that's the big dot. It's around there, in the Clwyd Valley. And if you put on the next slide, Phil, we'll see the place itself. So that's a side view. It's a huge retreat centre. Sleeps about 60 people. And there's a community of Jesuits who live there and work there all the time. And you see it's not spelled as you would expect. B-E-U. That's the gardens in my first time there, June, July. Beautiful. And the next one, Phil? So that's the view from the front. That's another quiet garden in front of the building there. And I think there's a third one. Is there a third slide on it? Yeah. So that's a labyrinth in the grounds, and the view from my window on my first retreat. And there's a place called the Rock Chapel, which has got about 6 of these amazing stained glass windows. Somebody made them, one for each of her 6 children, and they are just absolutely breathtaking stained glass. So, what happened? Well, as I say, it's a large retreat house. It sleeps 60 people. And there are people coming and going on various length retreats all the time. And how they do it so unobtrusively, I really am not really sure. But people come and go all the time, and you're never aware of people humping suitcases or making a noise. It's a super quiet place, very prayerful place. So you arrive and settle into your room, and after a brief meeting with your spiritual director, your silence begins, and the silence then extends to the end of your 10-day stay, with a little slot each day with your spiritual director. So the shape of the day for me, the second time I went, I should say, I ran. The first time I didn't take my running stuff because I thought I was going on a normal retreat, and it isn't a normal retreat. There's a lot of sitting about because you're in prayer. So I took my running stuff, and so I ran about 7, and breakfast was about 8. All the meals are taken in silence, although they do put music on to cover the munching and crunching and burping. And then after breakfast, a prayer period. There are lots of places to pray, inside and outside. The prayer periods tended to take me about an hour and a half. There's a very deliberate pattern that Ignatius gives of preparation for prayer, entry into prayer, the prayer period itself, and then reflection on the prayer. And actually, the reflection on the prayer is supposed to be done in a different geographical location at a different time. So it is quite involved, I suppose. Then I had a little time with my spiritual director before lunch, then lunch, another prayer period, a walk sometimes, like a half-hour walk squeezed in, then another prayer period, dinner at 7, another prayer period, and then bed. And it just sounds impossible. If you view prayer as I used to view prayer, you think, my goodness, that just sounds terribly hard work. And I can tell you, it's one of the most joyful things I've ever done in my life. I couldn't wait to get back to prayer after I'd been there a few days. Does anybody have any questions? That's a bit of a blast of information. Break the ice, Mary. You're a teacher. Yeah. Well, you're supposed to consult with your spiritual director before you start reading. Reading isn't really silence. It can be done in silence, but it's not silence because you're filling your mind with the words. And so reading, the very first retreat I went on, I took a pile of books because I really was seeing it as an opportunity, a reading week. And I was shocked on the opening meeting when the spiritual director said, please don't be tempted to fill your retreat with words. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, reading. And I literally cold sweat. What am I going to do? There's no washing machine to fill. There's no meals to cook. There's nothing to do. I've got to read. But actually, you don't. You don't have to read. But yeah, you're not really encouraged to read. You're not encouraged to listen to music. You're not supposed to be making any noise. So no earbuds, no quiet radio in your bedroom, no podcast when you're going to sleep. Alan. Well, with the Ignatian exercises, it is very, very structured. And actually, that brings me to that little table at the back there, just behind where Fiona and Kirsten are sitting. There's a whole lot of resources on there to do with the pilgrimage, but also there is some of the materials that my spiritual director gave me for the prayer periods. So you'll see there's a date scribbled at the top of each one, and you'll see there are about 4 prayer periods on each one. And so, yes, there's an entry into prayer, there's a focus for the prayer, and then there's the exit from it. So have a look at that, Alan, because it is very structured. There are choices within it, so there are scriptures that you can choose between rather than trying to get through them all. So there's some fluidity, but not much. But I love rigidity, so it didn't bother me. There was someone else. Yes, Pat. Well, yeah. So what Pat's asking is, what input did my spiritual director have? How did he introduce and help me through the exercises? Hello, Jed. This feels a bit strange. So the first thing is that when you apply to do the exercises, and the application form is many pages long and requires 2 referees. So Steve had to write quite a long reference for me, and you can be declined. And there are quite a few questions about whether you've had any psychiatric illness, whether you're on any medications, and right at the end of the application, you need to sign a waiver that agrees that you will leave if you're asked to leave. So they recognise that it is a demanding thing to do, and obviously they don't take everyone who asks to do it. And it is demanding. The silence in itself is demanding. I, having done a fair bit of silence, found the initiation of a 10-day silence a little bit panicky, a little bit of a panicky experience. So but primarily what Jed was doing was orienting me around the way Ignatius encourages us to pray, and to, I suppose some of it was teaching about the imagination. So coming from our stream of spirituality, to think of the imagination as a tool that the Holy Spirit might use to speak to you just might feel a little dangerous, a little bit unpredictable. What if you're just making it up? Those kind of things. And so Ignatius is big on discernment. If you've read anything about Ignatius, he talks about discernment a lot. And that is about discerning of, well, the scripture says discerning spirits. The good spirit, whether the good spirit is speaking to you or whether the bad spirit might be trying to influence you. And so there's a lot of, so Jed would talk me through some of the tests if I had a prayer experience and I was sharing with him what I had felt had happened. And sometimes there were times when I said, I'm not really sure that was from God. How can we tell? And so we would talk through what the focus of the experience was, how I had felt, what God could have said, and we tested it together. So it was very much, to be honest, me being me. He didn't get a word in edgeways most of the time. Bless him, he sat and listened a lot. But he was presenting me with the exercises. And especially in the first week, there's a lingering over knowing that you're loved by God. And the exercises, you're not supposed to move on to the next stage until your director's really sure that you've had an encounter with that revelation of how loved you are by God. And so he said at one point, they're a bit like an accordion that bellows that you can fill with air, and it sort of, you can squeeze it at different paces, so you can move through the exercises flexibly depending on how your experience with God is going. And so they're judging that, and he's setting exercises each day depending on where he feels I've got to. Has that answered the question? So, anyone else? Any questions? Okay, so I'll just going to share some principles, some ideas now, I think, from it. One of the quotes that I read in I think the first day, the most important qualities in a person who enters the exercises are openness, generosity, and courage. And I found the more I offered, the more open I was, the more willing I was, the richer it got. And God just showed up and spoke incredibly powerfully to me. Silence. So this would be one of the reasons that they ask people to apply, that you couldn't just go and do 10 days of silence. And if any of you have tried silence, you know our culture doesn't really allow us to accustomize to silence. We have to create silence for ourselves. And there is a really strong impetus, still for me, when I go into silence to get some noise going, basically. Well, I must turn the radio on. And it's really good for us to stop and think, what is it I am turning the radio on for? Do I know what's on the radio? Am I turning it on for what's on? Or am I really just turning it on? Am I really just looking for some noise round about me? But once I move through the fear and the panic, sometimes, and the idea of boredom, I think I'm going to get bored, then I find my whole body enters into the silence and not just my head. And I have a slowing down, a slowing pace, and what I call soft eyes. So soft eyes and soft ears, I tend to be very detail-oriented and quite sharp to errors, and I can edit things really easily, and I notice things that are out of place. And I find silence affects that, and I soften. And so I'm seeing a room full of people instead of the individuals and what patterns on Chris's top. Do you see what I mean? It's a softer kind of view of the world and a softer listening to the world to, instead of honing in on little noises, more hearing more gently. One of the things I love about silence is there's no need to prepare for conversation when you're in a prolonged silence. So you see someone as they walk in the door, I think, oh, here comes Barbara. What might I say to her? What might she say to me? And let's say Barbara and I had a big row yesterday. I might just feel, a little bit frightened of meeting Barbara. I need to apologize or whatever. All that work that we do all the time, and we do it subconsciously, that falls away. Because you're going to meet people, but there's no expectation you're going to speak to them or that they're going to speak to you. And so you're not formulating that and thinking about it or maybe worrying that they might say things for good or for ill. And obviously the distraction of normal living falls away. You're not in your own home. There's no work to do. There's no children to look after. There's nothing to read. There's no television. There's nothing to distract you. And so what comes front and center is who you are. I read once that if the first difficulty with silence is that we meet ourselves. And sometimes we don't like ourselves enough to be with ourselves. And that's one of the first struggles of silence. If I put the radio on, then I can be with that person and not really just with me. So in silence, I'm present to myself, and then I can be present to God. Because He is constantly present to me, but I'm more often than not distracted. I found this quote that I just think is lovely. God is mystery, and it is silence that most profoundly helps me delve into that mystery. To be with it, to be spoken to be shown something, to be opened out, to be drawn in, to be called to deep friendship. And then a little poem by Thomas Merton. Uncrowd my heart, O God, until silence speaks. In your still small voice, turn me from the hearing of words and the making of words and the confusion of much speaking to listening, waiting, stillness, silence. So I found God to be more present than I've ever known Him to be. Very gentle, but very alive. And I really believe that our imaginations are God's gift to us, just like our bodies are, and they can be called upon to serve Him. And as I say, there are lots of tests. In fact, I've put out some of the discernment tests that we can use to be sure that what we are believing is from God is from God. It's not wishful thinking. And to know whether we're off on one, as I would say, or we're hearing God. So I found the prayer at times very challenging. The first week particularly, there's meditations on sin and death and hell. It does start with the love of God, and I had a really powerful encounter with the love of God, but then you do that, the focus is on that because you're going then to the brokenness of the world, sin and death and hell. And that was very searching and challenging. And then there's this funny thing about thirst. I didn't really learn to pray. Confessions of a Minister. Didn't really learn to pray properly till I was in Brazil, really, I would say. Wasn't very good at praying. I think I tried to do a bit of meditative prayer, and I did a bit of petitionary prayer before I went to Brazil. But I didn't really learn to be present to God until I had a lot more space in my life, which Brazil provided. And I can't say I had much of a thirst for prayer. It was a bit of a drudge, a dry, hard work, and one of these things that I felt was my duty. But one of the results of doing the exercises has just been that the little bit of thirst that I had has been anything but sated. All it's done is just been enlarged. And I think there's a spiritual principle here. So I brought my tiny bit of thirst, like the loaves and fishes, and instead of sating me and patting me on my head and sending me away, God took the thirst and kind of multiplied it. And, I do have a thirst for prayer that I have never, ever had before. So I read this thing by a lady called Joyce Rupp, which did seem to describe well what I had felt. And it reassured me, actually, that other people have felt it. There is something in me that yearns and yearns and yearns for you, my God, and seems so unsatisfied. My prayer is like going to the table with my stomach growling and eating, still feeling starved when I leave the table. My taste buds are holding out for something else. Is this a time when I simply need to be grateful for the yearning, when I need to be faithful to your presence? So, my prayer life has changed very slowly over years and years, but this has been a real marker in making me really thirsty to be in God's presence. And as I say, what I offered him was a poverty of desire. And he's multiplied it. So if you're sitting there thinking, oh, she's so spiritual, please offer God your poverty of desire, because he can multiply that the same way as he multiplied loaves and fishes. Right, we're coming up to another piece of music now, but any more questions? That was good to have some questions earlier. Thomas. How long was I there for? So it's 12 days from the time I get on the train and abandon my family in Bookham and get back. It's 12 days, but it's 10 days actually doing the exercises. So it was 12 days at the beginning and 12 days right at the end. Maybe another 12 days in January. Anyone else? Paul. So Paul's asking, how did Ignatius come up with the exercises? He understood him to be a bit of a playboy knight. And that's true. He was a soldier and was very badly injured. Had, I think, both of his legs injured, but one of them really smashed up. And he was convalescing for a long time. And as I understand it, and this is where I'm really not an expert in the exercises, as I understand it, what he found was that as he wasn't able to get about much, he used to use his imagination, as many of us will, to imagine, well, let's say in Bookham, you imagine your mortgage is paid off and that your husband isn't aging, he's staying young, and your children are immaculately behaved, and you've got no issues with problems with relatives, and you're driving a BMW, that kind of thing. He would be imagining in his context conquests, great victories and being with beautiful women and all those kind of things. And he found that at the end of these forays in his imagination, he really felt very flat and sad and dissatisfied. And he picked up a Bible. There was a Bible, where he was, and he began to read. And he found that when he employed his imagination in imagining serving this Jesus, his heart was filled with joy and excitement and hope. And so that, I believe, that is the beginning of his spiritual journey. I did go down to the library. There's a library in St. Bino's, and they've got some of his writings. And I read a piece of, he was a priest by the time he was writing this. And he was talking about how he was trying to give the Eucharist, prepare to give and to give the Eucharist. And he just couldn't, because he was so filled with God that he was weeping. Even as he prepared it and as he tried to deliver it, he was just overcome with God's presence. So I think he was a very, very emotional man. It makes me feel great because it sort of allows that emotionalism that sometimes we can be so critical of in the church. I understand that's the beginning of it. Yeah. They're quite a read, I think. There's been translations, I think, because they would be quite difficult to read. I think they'd be in ancient Spanish of some kind, I think. Anyone else? Any questions? Sheila?
I was going to say, I'm presuming you ate together in silence, but where was the prayer? Were you in a separate room, or did you eat there in the Cathedral, or what?
The place is huge, and there are various chapels. There was one particular chapel which I called the Garden Chapel, which I just loved. And so I tended to be in there on a beanbag most of the time. But you could pray in the gardens, massive, massive gardens. You could pray in your own room. But there were lots of little chapels and quiet rooms dotted all around the place, and a way of telling whether they were occupied or not so that you didn't disturb other people. So there were lots and lots of places to pray, beautiful places. Anyone else? So, right, we're making really good time. We're going to dive into the pilgrimage now. And there's a lot more slides coming up. So, what was the pilgrimage? The pilgrimage was a solitary walk from Winchester to Canterbury, following as close as is possible, because it's not actually possible, the ancient Pilgrim's Way. And that's it, more or less. It's not actually very easy to stick to because there are all sorts of different opinions about where the Pilgrim's Way is. But there's the Cicerone book on that table at the back, and a guy called Lee Hatz who wrote it, and he's done lots of research, and he describes the walk in incredible detail. I still managed to get lost a few times, but basically I followed his book. I walked every mile with his book in my hand, and my backup was Nikki's Ordnance Survey app on my phone, which you could just open and press, and it would zero in on exactly where you were, and I could compare that to the map and make sure that I wasn't too far off the mark. So it does largely follow St. Swithin's Way, down in the Hampshire bit, and then it does follow bits of the North Downs Way, and then it does become, it's called the Pilgrim's Way in that latter bit in Kent. You quite often see signs that are actually calling it the Pilgrim's Way. In the earlier bit, it's much more often called St. Swithin's Way. Henry II walked this. No, he didn't. Okay? I walked the whole way thinking that Henry II walked it, and I'll tell you at the end what actually happened. So that's the map. How did I do it? I've used the book, and I used the OS map. I booked accommodation. If you go on to the next slide, I booked accommodation along the way. My husband wasn't all that keen on the wild camping idea. I don't like breaking the law, and in England you'd have to sleep along the way. So I decided to book accommodation. And so far left there, you see our lovely Kirsten. She drove me down to Winchester on the Sunday. What you can't see there is the rucksack, which becomes a bit of a story. But she took me down to Winchester, and we stayed in a friend's house on the Sunday night. And then she set me off. She took me to the Cathedral in the morning to send me off. Nikki Pugh is a lady who is the same age as me. Look at her, she looks about 20. But she trained with me she's a midwife. She was a midwife. We trained together. And I delivered her 2 girls. And they are in their 20s now, so it was really lovely to stay with Nikki. And because we were quite close, she made a cheeky call to Phil, and he came over for dinner the night I was in Oxted. The next one along... One of the things I did was I mailed a whole lot of churches on the route, and I said, this is who I am, this is what I'm doing. A, I'm Scottish, so I'm a skinflint. B, I'm a Baptist minister, so I'm not all that wealthy. And so I'm looking for cheap ways of being put up. Do you fancy putting a stranger up in your house? Yeah, I know, Thomas, it's an outrageous thing to do. And most people wouldn't even answer the email. These people answered the email. So this is Roger and Jane, who live in Alsford. They're both church wardens in different... It's not dioceses, is it? What's the little thing that's smaller than a benefice? A benefice. Parish. So they cover various churches between them, but both church wardens. Absolutely delightful people. And that is Rita, who lives in Farnham. And she met me at the station, put me up, just had a most delightful... I found out that the guy who married her when she got married, the minister who married, is a lifelong family friend of my parents'. She was just absolutely lovely lady. I stopped in Box Hill, obviously night 5. I arrived in Box Hill, so it made sense to come home. I had one night at home. And various Airbnbs, Guildford, Merstham, a place called Snodland. I had a delicious Airbnb I spent 2 nights in. Otford, stayed in Otford Manor, if you know Oak Hall Holidays. Nikki and I spent an overnight in Otford Manor before the leg that she did with me. And a hotel in Alton, paid for by a church member in Alton, who I never met, a couple that were going on holiday, said that they would have put me up, so they paid my bill. I know. And in Y, I stayed in a nice hotel because it was on my birthday. And then the last night, or not the last night, one of the nights, the lowest point was out of extreme stinginess, I booked a Days Inn. Now, some of you might know that Days Inn are only in motorway service stations. Have any of you ever tried to reach a motorway service station on foot? Don't, right? Because I thought it would be a lot easier than it was. It was not easy. It was really dangerous. I had to walk, one of these massive roundabouts where slip roads come off and on. I had to walk round this roundabout, so I had to run across slip roads with a rucksack and onto unmade up areas that weren't even flat grass. I mean, I was falling into holes, and at one point a big truck stopped because I think he saw I was going to kill myself, and he held the traffic back while I crossed the road. It was just awful. Anyway, I left on 29th of August, got back on the 11th of September. The plan had been to be back for my birthday, but between Phil's surgery and Mum's surgery, I had to adjust the dates a bit, so I was away for my birthday, but that ended up being a bit of a blessing. God spoke to me. I was alone for all of it except 3 days. So if you put on the next slide, Phil, there's Dad. Dad did the sheer to Box Hill leg with me. My sister did the Merstham to somewhere else leg with me. And that's my feet and my sister's feet. And the next one, Phil, I think is me and Nikki. Oh, right, you've only got half of me. Nikki, as I say, met me in Otford and stayed overnight, and we did 2 legs together. But we'll come to that in a minute. So I was generally alone, except for those 3 days. 13 days walking, I think, 3 of them with other people. Why? The guy that paid for my hotel in Alton had a very amusing exchange with me, where he just sent me back an email saying, why? Solitude seems to be good for me. So some of it was to have some solitude. I do like a challenge, but it seemed to be something that I just felt God prompted me to do it. I had wanted to do Camino, And I was giving up on that idea a few days before my sabbatical started when Rob, who knows everything about everything, said, "You know there are pilgrimages in Britain, Jill." And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, there's one just up there." So, okay. So started looking at the Pilgrim's Way. So it is a vivid experience of some of life's lessons, and much more vivid than I had expected it to be honest. It was harder than I thought it would be. It was very uphill, not just physically at times, and I often didn't know the way. And that really does feel like life, doesn't it? And I did discover my need of people, which was a good lesson for me. So if you go on to the next slide, Phil, you will see just a little bit of a variety of the kind of roads and paths that I was walking along. So that one's obviously right through a field. That one was just about a path. And the next slide, Phil, that was a lovely bench that I sat on for a little while. Next slide. Yeah, so it really is, some of it's made-up roads. In the Kent, it was a lot of made-up roads, a lot of metalled roads. But in Hampshire and Surrey, a lot of paths, a lot of unmade-up roads and little tracks through woods. And it was a really delightful experience. Next slide. And then there was a road like that where I came and thought, oh, okay, that was really deep water. How am I going to get across there? That was interesting. And that's a field that I got lost in because I left the road. I thought I was following the directions, but I wasn't. And I got really, really lost because it's really tall, that stuff. And after a few feet, you've no idea I had no idea the direction I'd come in or the direction I was going in. So that the OS map thing was my only. I just had to keep going, and actually to go up and down the rows because you can't go across the way because it's so tightly packed. I was terrified a farmer was going to find me and shout at me. Right, next slide, Phil. I can't remember what the next one is. Oh, go back. Right. So 28th of August, I attended a quiet group on a Saturday morning. So the day before I left, I went to this quiet group. And this was the reading. And at the time, it struck me as remarkable, but I didn't realise what a preparation it really ought to have been if I'd been a bit more attentive. It came from the Abbey of the Arch devotional reading. And I think actually Susan, who's here tonight, had provided us with it. So it said this. There is also an ancient tradition at this time of year in Ireland, this is 28th of August, the day before I went, to go on pilgrimage. A pilgrimage is, of course, not a vacation, but an immersion in the landscape and a courting of holy disruption along the way. An immersion in the landscape and a courting of holy disruption along the way. And it set a question. The question was, would your attitude to the challenges in your life invite a different response if you were to look upon them as holy disruptions instead of inconveniences or worse? Confession, I didn't really expect anything to go wrong on my walk because I was really prepared. I was really well prepared, and I did not believe, even as we read that, we meditated on it, we talked about how remarkable it was. It was a reading about pilgrimage the day before I went on a pilgrimage. I still did not believe that it was really going to have it was speaking to me. And it really was speaking to me. It was a very real question. So put on the next slide. So the first thing that happened when Kirsten and I arrived in Winchester was that for the first time in my life, I was bitten by a dog. Yeah, I know. It was a dog about that size. And it didn't get its feet. I think I had a Holy Spirit, move! And I sort of shoved Kirsten out the way, and it just got me. It did break the skin. But it really took me aback because I thought, how can that be the first thing that's happened on this amazing time with God I'm going to have? And the first thing that happens is this horrible little event. And the woman was like, oh, sorry, he's never done that before. And we walked on, and Kirsten, who's a dog owner, said, I think he probably has done that before. It was not a nice beginning, was it? It was lovely to have Kirsten, but I was quite thrown by it. Then, within an hour or so, I realized that the one thing that I needed to make the iPhone work, and I had a battery pack that had 2 charges in it, and my plug and the phone didn't have the lead. Now, I had packed, and I'd repacked, and I'd packed with such care and attention. And we go on holiday, and we never don't have what we need, because I pack with precision. The one thing I needed to make the phone work was lying in our lounge. And that wasn't the first time I found that I didn't have my lead. Anyway. The next thing was the door handle. That was an overnight in Guildford, which I won't go into too much, but I was frightened in my Airbnb, noise and I found myself unable to sleep and feeling I had to lock the door. And I've called it danger actual and perceived, because I don't really know in how much danger I really was in, but I felt in danger. I don't often feel in danger. And then this road closed. This really was amazing. There's a place called Titsy Place it's in Surrey, near Oxted, beyond Oxted. I stayed the night with Nikki, and I walked on to and found this place. And Titsy Place is one of the places that the Pilgrim's Way goes right through the centre of it, and the owners have decided that they don't want pilgrims going through past their front door. So there's a huge loop round their grounds of a couple of miles, and it was all shut. It was completely closed because they were felling trees. And everybody else was just like, oh, I'll just go home then, have a shorter walk than I thought. And I was like, I'm going to Canterbury. I can't go home. I'm going to find some way of getting there. So I went off the road and I climbed this bank that was like this, that had felled trees already on it, that were loose. And I'm not sure I've ever been as frightened in my life. I had my rucksack on, so it was quite heavy work, and scrambling up these banks, muttering my prayers under my breath, and really hoping that I wasn't going to be caught, because I think I was breaking the law. Pretty sure I was breaking the law. And then I found a little path, and I was, oh great, tracking along, and suddenly had, and they were felling trees like 50 feet in front of me. And I was like, whoa, into the growth, scrabbling around, feeling highly illegal. I don't really break the law, and I was really, I had to break the law. So anyway, I eventually found my way, thanks to the OS Maps function. I did find my way around. And then there's the Days Inn story. That was really frightening. So what I found was really a load of unexpected danger, a load of feeling really vulnerable, really like I was immersed in the landscape, and I was courting holy disruption. It was like God was, oh, you think you're ready? Think you're prepared? Think you're safe? Well, you still need me. You still need me. And I found myself crying out to God, really, really crying out to him. Then the next slide is about people. One of the next things that struck me so powerfully. So this is Winchester Cathedral. This is the canon who prayed for me before I left. And she was so excited, as I was when she explained, because I'd looked for various significant days to start my pilgrimage on, and none of them would fit with all the practical things that were happening in the family. And when Kirsten and I got there for the communion that morning, she was doing a reading from Bunyan, and she announced it's Bunyan Day, who wrote Pilgrim's Progress. And so when I appeared and said, oh, I'm a pilgrim. And she was so excited, and she prayed for me and blessed me, a blessing from a Pilgrim's Progress translation in Pilgrim's Progress, paraphrase of Pilgrim's Progress. So she was really sweet. This is a Nikki that I met in Aylesford Priory, who was a really lovely woman, and I was in a room on my own. I was in a little chapel, and I was singing, although it did say you're meant to be quiet. And she came in, and I didn't know she was there. And I continued to sing, and then when I stopped and I was coming out, I saw her, and I thought, oh, sorry. And she said, oh, it was lovely. Would you do it again? And I was like, oh, no. And I sort of hushed her and left. And I felt God going to be, God, you should have done it again. And then I saw her in the cafe outside having a cream tea. So I sat down and we had a chat. And I sang a little bit with her. She was a parish nurse. I've never heard of a parish nurse. But yeah, she had a lovely job, told me all about it. So anyway, the people, oh yes, the rain and the glass of water. Nikki and I were together in the glass of water one. I met some lovely people, and most of the people I met were really delightful, and they were generous and beautiful. But there were 2 times when we encountered really people who weren't welcoming, and one of them was, we'd done a long walk, hadn't we? And we came out into a village, and there was a group of women. One of them was on a chair on some grass, and some people standing around. It was clearly they were in their garden, and we asked for water. We asked for a cup of water. Matthew 25, and they said no. I know. It was unbelievable, wasn't it, Nikki? And it was quite. It was painful. And then there was a village that I walked into, which I had tried to book the B&B, and the guy, it hadn't worked out. But as I walked into the village, it started to pour. It was the only time that it rained in the whole time. It absolutely bucketing. And so I went to this pub. It was actually only about 11 o'clock in the morning. They were cleaning. And I just stuck my head in the door and said, I couldn't just use your toilet and just shelter here for 10 minutes till the rain goes off. And and didn't want me to even use the toilet. Eventually, she let me use the toilet. But then by the time I came out of the toilet, it was really raining. I mean, it was pelting. And I said, please. She said, no, we're cleaning. I said, please, I'll just stand outside the door here, just under the eaves. And she stood and watched me walk out into the pouring rain. And again, the power of people, and the power of someone's heart, for good or ill, really, really struck me. We think of a simple generosity. What does it cost to give you a glass of water? But it's so powerful to be kind and welcoming and generous. And so yeah, amazing. Next slide, Phil. I better not get lost in telling stories. This was great. I had a really remarkable day with Nikki. Nikki does huge long walks. You all know that. Big long walks. And weirdly, because of how the accommodation had all worked out, the day she was with me was my shortest walk. And actually, because of where our accommodation was, I'd actually done a couple of miles of it to get to the accommodation. So I think we had like 4 miles to do. So it was a really, really short day. And my later days were going to be really long. And we walked, and Nikki was saying, I think we should go further. And I said, the accommodation's all booked. I can't change it. No, we've got to just stick with what I've done. And that morning, the only morning I've ever done this, I had texted my accommodation in the morning and said, still everything all right for the Airbnb. It was the only time in the whole walk that I did it. And just as we were getting into a bit of a word fight with her saying, we've got to go further. It's only 11 o'clock in the morning. We've got the whole day. We could... and I was like, oh, no, I don't want to change my plans, and I don't know where I'll sleep. And bing, the phone goes, and I read it. And my accommodation's saying, I've just tested positive for COVID. You can cancel with no charge, or I can make all these arrangements to stay separate from you. So I looked at Nikki, and she's so ready for a miracle. She was completely believing it was a miracle right away. I was still very doubtful. So she said, ring the next night, ring the accommodation for the next night. They'll be able to have you for a second night. I said, they're never going to be able to have me with no notice. Ring them. So I rung them. Can you have me a night early for 2 nights instead of 1? Yeah. And so we walked 14 miles that day, 14 and 15 miles. Boy, I was really in pain by the end of it. And she was so uninterested in my pain. She's striding out in front, she's singing songs, she's ignoring my complaints. And I wish I'd brought my journal actually. I wrote in my journal, sometimes you just need a friend who doesn't care about your pain and is going to charge on half a step in front and get you to the goal. And she changed the last 5 days of that walk because everything was then workable. I could do all the distances, and I would have had great difficulty doing. I had 16 miles to do on the last day, and I wouldn't have managed it if it hadn't been for Nikki. So people can really make a huge difference, and God calls us to interdependence, calls us to lean on people, to be humble enough to ask for help. Right, the next one, I think I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit. The next slide, Phil. This is... Oh, yeah, that was a funny one. That's a path. Do you see the path on the right-hand side? But that's what it looked like when you looked down like that. There's no discernible path at all. So you'd to keep sort of stopping and going like that to make sure you're still on the path. It's really weird. But I did feel God speak to me about keeping your eyes on the horizon instead of always looking down at your feet. Next slide, Phil. Oh, these are just some lovely pictures of some of the walks that I did. And the next one?
How long in total was your walk?
It was 13 days, Owen.
In miles?
Oh, 152 miles, 153 miles. That's some ancient yew trees, beautiful yew trees, and that's a bridge near Guildford. That's a fantastic painting. Hail, fellow, well met, come feast and restore. There was a drinking spout there for walkers. Next one, darling. Oh, yeah. So, is there not one about with me with my rucksack on? Sorry. I think I've got them in the wrong order. I set off with that huge purple rucksack. You saw me with Kirsten, a big rucksack. And I had like 8 T-shirts and multiple sets of underwear, and you name it, I had stuff like I was going for a fortnight in Turkey. There it is. So it was packed to the top, okay, with just in case stuff. And if I'd done D.A.V., I would have known, but I've never done D.A.V. And by day 5 in Guildford, I had a knee injury. I've run 2 marathons. I've never had a knee injury in my life. But I was really in pain. Going downhill, I was really in pain. That's the brace that Phil bought me. And so I offloaded actually a load of stuff on the first night and a huge amount of stuff when I was home on day 5. Got it down to this little rucksack. And that's what I did the last 10 days with. And God really spoke to me about preparation and the security that we can have in our sense of being prepared. It's a bit of a false sense of security. Right, the 10th of September, if you go back to that one, and then we'll have a piece of music. This is really just a weird thing that happened. This is my birthday, 10th of September. And on the 10th of September 2000, I was in Croydon. We had a family party. And Bookham Baptist Church had a extraordinary Sunday meeting to vote whether they would call Reverend Gill Hawkins. And so that was the day I was called to Bookham Baptist Church, the 10th of September 2000, moved here in the middle of October. Then, by all these surgeries and practical things, I found myself walking on the 10th of September, and I arrived in this village. Oh, and when I came to Bookham, I had a very strange picture. The very first time we visited the church, before I was called, before you even thought about calling me, we came through that door because all the new extension hadn't been done. And as I approached the building, I had this picture of a big glass door with a blue surround and me with a key unlocking it. Nothing like the door that's out there. And we had our encounter here, and I was called to preach with a view, and some months later, after some teaching about women in ministry, I was called in September and arrived in the middle of October, met Ian McFarlane, and he said, do you want to see the new building? Because they were meeting in the Donnay school because they were having all this refurb done. And I said, yeah, let's go to the new building. And we walked up that slope out there, and Ian turned to unlock the door. I caught my breath. It's a glass door with a blue surround, which when I had seen it in my picture, didn't exist. It probably hadn't even been manufactured. It was April of that year that I saw that picture. And I went home and said to Phil, you'll never guess that the blue door, it's there now, it's in the building. So I got to this village this day, 21 years later, I hadn't even put that together, and got to this church and it was locked. There's a little notice that said, if you go across to that house, this little lady will give you the key. So Mrs. Pitts, it was 9:30 in the morning. She was very excited to see me. Could I get into the church? Yes. Are you able to open it for me? No, I can't come and open it for you. I'll give you the key. She gave me the key. It's a huge, huge key. As I was walking over to the church, it was like a little series of things slotted into my head, and God said to me, do you remember? This is your 21st birthday. 21st birthday of your calling to BBC, and here's a key to unlock a church door. It was really amazing. I went in there and sang, we bow down and confess your Lord. And it was really, there was a strong sense of God's Spirit. So, this is a quiet and still activity. There's a Jesuit priest called Peter van Bremen, and he wrote this: prayer begins with the realization that I am loved by God as I am. God's love is based on nothing. Therefore, it is the most basic and secure fact in my life. God's love is based on nothing. Therefore, it is the most basic and secure fact in my life. I simply let myself be loved by God. This is not so much an activity of mine, but a passivity in which I let God's love soak in and permeate my whole being. So that's the invitation. So we try and be true to the pattern. Ignatius wants us to think, how do we feel? How do you feel? What sort of mood are you in? You can write down how you feel. And having understood how we feel, what do we think we need? What do we want to ask God for? Maybe you want courage, openness, trust, peace. Maybe you need something particularly for this season. So if you were doing this alone now, you would choose where you're going to pray and you would go there, make yourself comfortable. Usually uncrossed legs and arms. But to be comfortable, to seek to become still. That's still in our bodies and still in our minds. I know it's not our tradition, but you can make a sign of the cross if you want to. And I'm just going to read a quote, and then I'm going to pause, and then I'll read it again. And then we're going to have just 2 minutes of silence. Where we're really seeking to let God speak to us. You might find yourself drawn to something that is in the quote, a phrase or a word. Whatever feels alive. Stay with that. It's not about thoroughness. O Lord God, you called me from the sleep of nothingness just because in your tremendous love you want to make good and beautiful things. You have called me by name in my mother's womb. You have given me breath and light and movement, and walk with me every moment of my existence. I am amazed, Lord God of the universe, that you attend to me and cherish me. Create in me the faithfulness that moves you, and I will trust you and yearn for you all my days. Amen. O Lord my God, you called me from the sleep of nothingness just because in your tremendous love you want to make good and beautiful things. You have called me by name in my mother's womb. You have given me breath and light and movement, and walk with me every moment of my existence. I am amazed, Lord God of the universe, that you attend to me and cherish me. Create in me the faithfulness that moves you, and I will trust you and yearn for you all my days. Amen. I know that's been a very short moment. It might have felt long if you're not used to silence, but now before we leave the prayer, I want to encourage you to speak to the Lord silently, just in your heart, using your normal words. You speak out of that prayer what it is you would like to say to God. So let's just spend a moment or two longer in the silence, and we, in that time, pray, bring our hearts to God. Glory be to the Father, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be. Amen. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Strange, little remembered half of the prayer for some reason. I don't know how that was for you. I'll be interested to hear how that was for you. Ignatius would say, now you go home, or maybe tomorrow morning, find another place, and go back to any moment where you felt that you found God, you heard God. Any moment, he talks about the more, that wherever there's life, wherever there's something where God speaks and you feel connected to him, you feel that he's speaking to you, that he's encouraging you, it's worth going back. Go back to the picture, go back to the passage, go back to the thought, and say, is there more? Do you want to say more? Is there something else? So it's good to reflect on our prayer times. There is one more piece of music that I want to share, but I've realised I haven't quite finished my slides, Phil, so should we just flip through the last few slides, because there's a picture of Canterbury Cathedral there. So that was me seeing Canterbury as I approached. If you can see it right in the middle of that left-hand picture, that's the cathedral. That was my first view of Canterbury Cathedral on my last day. This is the book, the guidebook there. I was just so gutted, because the story was that Henry II, out of penance for the murder of Thomas à Becket, because he'd said, who will rid me of this troublesome priest? And some of the soldiers thought it was an edict and went off and killed Thomas à Becket in Canterbury Cathedral. And so I think 2 years later, Henry II was going to do this walk in penance. And I had understood somewhere along the line that he did it barefoot and he walked the whole way. And Nikki had said to me, I'm not sure he would have done it all the way barefoot. And when I got there, on this page, it says, in 1174, Henry II dismounted to begin his walk of penance into Canterbury. And that is like a little village. It was only like a mile from the cathedral. And I had thought he did it in bare feet, and it also said in another page that he hadn't done it in bare feet until the very last minute, like the last 100 yards. And that's Canterbury. The next slide, I think there's a canon there praying for me in the next slide. So that's the murder room in Canterbury Cathedral. I got in for nothing, having walked 152 miles. And that lovely canon prayed for me. It was their very first evensong of COVID, since COVID. Happened to be the day that I arrived. So we attended evensong together. I think that's the last one, is it, Phil? Yes. Guys, thank you so much for coming.